Alright everyone, the state of Vermont is planning to tackle suicides related to firearms. Now interestingly, read this little ditty that they've got right up here. And you'll see something that can be extrapolated to the national scale. It's actually true. And the majority of the majority of the time that somebody has died as a result of a firearm in the United States, it's suicide. It has nothing to do with a mass shooting, or, a drive-by, even gang violence or anything like that. Most of the time it's somebody harming themselves or trying to do so. Between suicides and attempted suicide by firearm, you've got the bulk of all the potentially aggressive shootings, crimes where there's technically a victim. Now, I think personally that suicide is something to be put squarely in mental health. It's still classed as a crime in this country for some odd reason. And in the state of Vermont, perhaps, there's more of a focus on mental health. And I wish them well in doing this, but you've got to realize some things about Vermont. Here's why depression and suicide can become a problem here. Number one is specifically and simply because of climate. Specifically speaking, during the winter months, seasonal affective becomes an issue for a lot of people. This is where you get a lot of depression that is prolonged for several months. Basically, November through February, there's not a lot of sun in this state. Up until then, it's okay. Like October, yeah, it's chilly-ish, but there is sun, and it's warm enough, so you can go out for a walk and do some work outside. November, it's, getting a little bit more on the iffy side. And then really there's not a whole lot going on until February has ended. Once you get into March, it gets nice again, and the sun gets a little bit warmer. But the sun barely even warms your back in midwinter here. It's kind of like, I guess, being in Finland or Siberia. There's one problem. Problem number two is the opiate crisis. We're overrun by people who are addicted to painkillers. Fentanyl has entered the supply now. People are overdosing. Yeah, once somebody has had a really bad overdose, it can play havoc with their mind. I know this from experience. It took me several years to recover fully from my overdose, and that had nothing to do with painkillers. That was on a substance that at the time was perfectly legal, and it was marketed as, oh, this is like the safe legal alternative to weed, which is bullshit. I'm actually glad that it was banned. I'm glad people should just smoke weed if they need some sort of cannabinoid. Stay away from the spice bullshit. Just get some bud. Most states have at this point at least partially decriminalized it. You probably know in your community, do the cops really care if you're smoking this joint, or do they kind of realize it's going on and take a hands-off approach, and then act accordingly? Disclaimer, of course, it's probably still illegal technically in your state. So there's number two. Number three, there are a lot of people in the state that are underemployed. There are a lot of people who work low-wage jobs here. Now we have like a higher minimum wage, but that doesn't help much because the cost of living is higher. So all of these things combined help to promulgate a higher than normal suicide rate. And cracking down specifically on suicide by gun, I would think is the wrong thing to do. It should be a full-on mental health approach that deals with depression, seasonal depression being here included in that, as well as drug addiction. That's what they should be doing. Simply looking at firearm suicides doesn't make a whole lot of sense. If you were to remove the firearm from the situation, they're still truly meaning to kill themselves. They'll buy a bottle of aspirin maybe. They'll sit in their car in their garage and idle it until they asphyxiate maybe. They'll go for a dip with a toaster oven. There are other ways that they'll hang themselves. There are other ways that people kill themselves. Looking just at firearm suicide, that doesn't address the overall suicide rate. We have this weird situation where any act of violence via gun is, for some odd cultural reason, considered worse than an act of violence that has the same exact result committed by anything else under the sun. Most of the homicides in this country don't even involve a firearm. You're more likely to get stabbed or bludgeoned to death than you are shot in the United States. But nobody wants to talk about it because nobody's crazy enough to think that people should have to have a license and a waiting period to buy a rubber mallet or to buy a kitchen knife. Therein lies your problem. You get this weird situation where something is considered worse than anything else, simply because it happens to fire a bullet as opposed to stab somebody. But yeah, people, they'll do all manner of things to knock themselves off. You know, we've got a lot of mountains in this state. They'll just go and take a tumble off a cliff. They'll climb up to the top of the service center and throw themselves off. Or wherever else they happen to be. They'll just jump out into traffic. So you need to address the core fundamental cause of so much depression and so many suicidal tendencies, and not get, you know, caught up too much on the method behind it. It's like, are you gonna start requiring a driver's form of ID to buy rope because somebody might tie off a noose and hang themselves? That doesn't address the fact that there's depression. It doesn't address potentially opiate addiction or any of these other things. So I wish them well in their venture to reduce suicide, but if you're just caught up on the firearm side of suicide, that's not really going to accomplish anything. People move on to the next thing over, which is probably, in most cases, is probably they'll poison themselves. I don't know, maybe they'll get a bow. Maybe they'll get a knife and they'll open a vein too many times. That's about all. Peace out.